All right, welcome to Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, episode 7 now of the podcast. We're getting a little bit closer to episode 10. I want to get to a couple things. I'm going to touch on a couple topics here in this episode, and then I want to get to my main topic in just a minute. But some of these things I want to kind of run through real quick is kind of where the stock is for Michigan and Michigan State's programs right now, where it stands here in 2019 as we get into the last 2 weeks or so of the regular season. To me, Michigan's stock is really on the rise. They looked like a 7-win team after the Wisconsin game, and I think that a lot of fans also felt that way after that game. There weren't too many Michigan fans that I saw, especially on social media, that felt all that great about where the program was at that point, because really the last 3 games or so that you had lost were all by blowouts at that point. And after every game, all you heard from the players and the coaches were, yeah, we just got out coached. We, didn't prepare enough. We didn't execute enough. And I think that just angered a lot of fans. It angered myself included. And I talked about it as much on the podcast as well. But then you also came out slow a few weeks later against Penn State, and you're thinking, oh boy, here we go. It's going to be the same exact thing. You're on the road against a team like Penn State. You get down big early. But in the second half, and Harbaugh later described it as Michigan's finest hour, it really does kind of feel like he was telling the truth there. Like, it seems like he knew a little more than the rest of us did by saying that, because since then, the offense really has kind of turned that corner and finally become what we had expected it to be. It might have just taken a little bit longer than we would have liked, but I think it's safe to say that it's finally kind of there now, and we all kind of got to enjoy it this past Saturday against Michigan State when they put up over 40 on them. And then for Michigan State, they've kind of gone the opposite way. They blew a huge lead against Illinois. They got blown out by Michigan. They've been blown out by Ohio State and Wisconsin as well. They've lost 5 straight. And really the only thing at this point in this season that could make it any worse, really, if you're a Michigan State fan, is if you somehow find a way to go to Piscataway on Saturday against Rutgers and you lose that game. That to me would be like the ultimate, where I don't think that if I were a Michigan State fan and they lose that game and they end their season, because put it this way, if you lose that game, you're probably not going to be bowl eligible. In fact, you won't be if you lose that game, because the best you can do is 5-7. If they lose that game, or even if they lose the Maryland game the week after, if they are not bowl eligible this year, I don't know how you can continue being a fan of Mark D'Antonio. Specifically, you can be a fan of the team, but I don't know how you continue to be a fan of Mark D'Antonio and the job that he's done the last couple of years with that program. I mean, you can talk about 2015 and when you won the Rose Bowl and you won the Big Ten, and, like a year or two later, you went to the playoff or whatever. You can talk about that stuff, but look, it's 2019. We're a couple months away from 2020. Those Rose Bowl games and things that you went to, those are 3, 4, 5 years gone now. And then the Lions, I mean, I really don't want to get into this right now. I mean, there's not really much you can say anymore. I mean, the Lions are just doing what the Lions do best, and that's lose and not look at all like they know how to play football, really, at least from a defensive standpoint. I mean, you went out there with a backup QB and put up 27 on Dallas, but I mean, it's time for the Lions to just officially start tanking, and I mean doing it on purpose. They're known for doing it kind of on accident, but it's time for them to start doing it for real, I think. And really, a lot of the blame, the issue, is on Matt Patricia specifically, and I've seen a lot of people complaining about the defensive coordinator, Paul Pasqualoni, and the job that he's supposedly doing. I don't think that it's really with him because it's Patricia's defensive scheme, and he ultimately, as the head coach, has the final say in play calling decisions. For example, look at his quote-unquote influential play call versus the Raiders. Now, that was an offensive play, but the same goes for defense. He has that final say on both sides. And really, the Lions fired a guy like Jim Caldwell who had a winning record during his time in Detroit. He took them to the playoffs twice during the 4 years that he was here. You let him go to bring in Patricia and his guys, and you have taken a large step back. A large step back. And I was actually thinking about it today along with the topic that I'll get to in a minute. But I was thinking about it today. I wonder if it's too late for them to get back Jim Caldwell. And if it's too late to bring back Tara Lawson as his defensive coordinator and bring back the defense that those guys had when they were here. Because if you pair that defense with the offense that they possess now, even with Jeff Driscoll, I think they'd probably be able to go out and win 8, 9, maybe even 10 games. And I would take that over the 5 or 6 that we're going to win this year. You know, the 6 that we won last year, I would take that any day. And then one thing I saw when I was doing my show prep for this episode a little while ago is that Eastern Michigan takes on Northern Illinois in football tonight on some Tuesday night MAC football action. And if Eastern were to win, they would become bowl eligible before Michigan State. I mean, could you imagine that? Could you imagine living in a world where Illinois and Eastern Michigan are bowl eligible before Michigan State? I mean, that's some Twilight Zone stuff right there if that were to happen. So I will try to watch that game even a little bit because I'm really interested to see if Eastern Michigan can pull that off. But the main topic that I wanted to get to today is the college football bowl projections that certain sites have been putting out. Specifically, I want to take a look at some of the predictions by ESPN and some of their analysts, and really taking a look at the situation that's kind of formed now in the Big Ten regarding the Rose Bowl. Because I was looking at it yesterday and this morning, and when you really think about it, it's actually quite interesting. And I've seen, since this morning, some people talking about it on Twitter as well. As it stands right now, there are 4 teams that can really be put in the conversation for the Rose Bowl this year coming from the Big Ten. Now that it looks as though Ohio State will almost surely make the college football playoff, that opens the door for these other teams. And those teams are Wisconsin, Minnesota, Penn State. And with them continuing to win, Michigan now enters the mix, I think, a little bit with sort of an outside shot at it. But you got Wisconsin, Minnesota, Penn State, and I'll even throw in Michigan, as I mentioned. Wisconsin already has the 2 losses, though, this season, so they would need to win out, as would Michigan. But they host Purdue this weekend before they go on the road to end the season at Minnesota. And Minnesota already has 1 loss, so basically what ends up happening is the loser of Minnesota and Wisconsin gets eliminated from the Rose Bowl discussion, and Michigan would have to win out, meaning they would have to beat Indiana and beat Ohio State, and hope that Penn State loses to Ohio State this weekend, just for Michigan to have a chance at it, really, to be able to stay in that discussion. And Penn State can really keep their hopes alive, even if they lose to Ohio State this weekend, by Michigan losing to them the following week. And then they also would benefit from the loser of Wisconsin and Minnesota, because then the loser of that game gets taken out of it as well. So as I mentioned, I saw some people talking about it on Twitter earlier. So one of the guys is someone that I, go back and forth with a lot in discussion on Twitter. He's at Flightcast Sports, and he said that Michigan's best scenario would be for them to win out, as I mentioned. Minnesota get to Indy and lose to Ohio State, and Ohio State to have one loss to Michigan. Between 2-loss Michigan, 2-loss Penn State, and 2-loss Minnesota, Michigan would have the best chance having beaten Ohio State, because obviously if Penn State loses to Ohio State, then they wouldn't, and then Minnesota would have lost in the Big Ten championship game to Ohio State. So out of the three, Michigan would be the only team to have beaten them. And you could even throw Wisconsin in the mix too. Wisconsin didn't beat them either. So he is right in saying that that would be the best case scenario for Michigan in that situation. Now, do I think that'll happen? Not really, but I mean, hey, here's hoping. But I do see Michigan finishing 9-3, and for me, that's not terrible considering, like I said, after the Wisconsin game, I saw them as a 7-win team, so I can live with being 9-3. And as I mentioned many times before on the podcast, in those 4 games of Michigan State, Penn State, Ohio State, and Notre Dame, to me, in order to get to 9 wins and then go to a bowl game and have a chance for 10, you had to go 2-2 in those games. And let's assume they lose to Ohio State, they still would accomplish that goal of going 2-2 in those games. And on top of that, this will be, no matter what happens in the Ohio State game, this will be the first time in the Jim Harbaugh era that Michigan's had a winning record against their rivals. Because he's already taken care of Notre Dame, he's already taken out Michigan State, so no matter what happens in a week and a half, he'll finish the season with his first winning record against his rivals. And somebody tweeted out either last night or this morning, you know, if Michigan beats Ohio State, but obviously they're not going to go to the Big Ten championship game or anything like that, even if they do beat Ohio State, what would you rate Michigan's season 1 to 10? And I said if they beat them, I'd say a 9. If they don't, I'd say like a 8. And I think that that's pretty realistic. But to wrap it up, as it looks right now, Michigan, according to ESPN, is projected to make the Holiday Bowl versus Washington. Or I've seen a couple times where they've been thrown in the mix for the Outback Bowl, assuming they finish 9-3. Michigan State, on the other hand, is projected to head to the Motor City Bowl. And I think when I checked this morning, they were projected to face Mac Brown in North Carolina. And then checking on the other two teams in that Rose Bowl discussion, Wisconsin and Minnesota are 2 of the favorites right now to make the Rose Bowl. According to ESPN, I think I saw one prediction for Penn State as well. That might have been on another site, though. But I'd be okay with Michigan in either the Holiday Bowl or the Outback Bowl. And I think that it would be really cool to see a team like Minnesota make it to a Rose Bowl, because how often does that happen? So I would definitely, and I've been rooting for Minnesota and PJ Fleck all season, especially talking about them a number of times on this podcast. So I would really like to see them make it. Do I think they will? Maybe, but like I said, we'll have to wait and see. I think that these last 2 weeks of the regular season are going to be very interesting in deciding who gets to go to the Rose Bowl and kind of seeing where everybody else kind of falls into line. So that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. A quick reminder to like, comment, and share on this post, and check out past episodes of the podcast on my website, takingthefield.com. That's taking-the-field.com. Or you can simply Google Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. You can also follow me on Twitter, where I talk a lot about sports at Stevie Mac Media, and I have a Facebook page dedicated to this podcast at TTFW Stevie Mac. And that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. Thanks for listening.